We have never been a loud people. Our elders always taught us that actions speak louder than words, so we learned to keep our heads down, keep our grades up, keep our kin close, keep our mouths shut. I wonder, what it does to a people when they stay quiet for so long. Do they forget their voice? The sound of their stories, the resilience of language? When you are no longer in your motherland, does your mother tongue still sing of home? What work songs lifted our spirits as we built the railroad? What prayers did we whisper as they sent us to camps in the mountains to meditate on all the ways we don't belong to this country? So we stayed quiet. As they burned our Chinatowns down and spit on our grandmas at bus stops, we stayed quiet. As they laughed in our faces and told us to go back where we came from, but they've mistaken our silence for compliance. Looked on our meekness as weakness. See, we, and not the submissive stereotype that's been depicted on silence, on us, they've gotten it twisted. See, silence is golden, as are we. A gradient of yellow to brown, every Koreatown a little Saigon an act of defiance. Every hunchbacked elder a humble giant. Silence is grace in the triumph, is peace in the riot. Silence is bold, a force. It is the brewing calm before the coming storm, and now the sky is splitting open and the rage is pouring forth, so this is for every kid who has ever tried to pull their nose bridge to make it taller. Every time they mocked us because our eyes are smaller. This is for our elders, both alive and remembered, for their lessons, the tough and the tender. For our full names, past and present, may they be pronounced, may they be respected. For every chink in the national fabric, every nip in the winter wind of prairie towns and northern hamlets coast to coast on stolen land. We are here. We've been here. From takeout joints and internment camps to internships and graduation caps, we are strong. We have pride. We fight. We fall. We rise. And to the ones who say we don't belong, it's them who should open their eyes.
Hi everyone. As a proud Canadian woman of South Asian descent, Asian Heritage Month and its celebration of the diversity of all Asian cultures means a lot to me. This year's theme is recognition, resilience, and resolve. It's about recognizing the contributions that communities of Asian descent in Canada have made and continue to make in building a more prosperous and equitable country, past, present, and future. It's about celebrating the resilience of communities of Asian descent who have faced racism and discrimination for generations. And since the COVID-19 pandemic hit, we've seen a devastating rise in acts of anti-Asian racism, in addition to the disproportionate impact the pandemic has had on certain segments of society, including racialized and young Canadians. And finally, it's about resolving to do better. We must all step up as allies and stand together against xenophobia, hate fueled by misinformation, and all forms of racism and discrimination. This Asian Heritage Month and beyond, please join me in honoring the significant contributions of communities of Asian descent in Canada and in denouncing all forms of anti-Asian racism. Let's all work together for a better and consciously more inclusive Canada. Keep well and safe.
First of all, many thanks to the organizers of this forum for taking the time to promote this extremely necessary conversation and dialogue. And I want to thank you as well for the opportunity to pass along my greetings to everybody involved. More and more, we find that politics, international geopolitical events, and other events in our country and without are becoming unjustly personalized. The focus of today's discussion to address racism directed toward our Asian neighbors could just as easily be used in more recent events to address racism toward our Jewish or Muslim neighbors, our Punjabi, Hindu, Indigenous, or Black communities. This alone is proof of how important today's discussion, and most importantly, the fundamental principles and values behind today's discussions, how important they truly are. As a nation, Canada is often a moderating voice in world affairs, and at times, that can and should include justified criticism of the actions of foreign governments. But the diaspora of any foreign government, those who by race, language, or culture are identified with another nation, or any minority, be they in Canada for millennia or otherwise, they should never be subject to personal abuse of any kind. And those who are inclined to commit to that kind of abuse have to be roundly condemned and dealt with according to the law and according to something just as important, and that's community standards. You see, today's session is, I think, an exercise in demonstrating what our community standards actually are in Canada. So a great deal of thanks has to go to Islam Unravelled and to all participants for the initiative that brought us together today to demonstrate what Canada's community standards really stand for.
Hello, I'm Mayor Kennedy Stewart. On behalf of our city, I want to thank you all for being here today to show up and to speak out against anti-Asian hate. The recent numbers on anti-Asian hate crimes rising by 717% bring attention to an angering yet important fact. Racism and hate lurk in our city, and to fight it, we need to speak out against it. Hatred and violence have no place here. Racism and bigotry are not welcome here. As allies, we have a responsibility to step up and use our voice. We must push back on white supremacy and stand together with our neighbors that are hurting. At the city, we recognize our history of colonialism and systemic racism. We have a serious role to play in anti-racist work and moving that work forward in collaboration with impacted communities. In response to anti-Asian racism, we have been hosting discussions with community leaders to identify actions the city can take to support a number of issues the community has already made clear to us. These include victims having limited resources or folks not having the tools to know how to respond when witnessing a racist incident. The city has also provided funding to the Chinatown Business Improvement Association for extra security to respond to racism and violence in their neighborhood, and we continue doing outreach to organizations and businesses in Chinatown to ensure they have the support they need. In Vancouver, we pride ourselves on having a diverse city with people of all backgrounds sharing their vibrant cultures and languages. It's an honor to be the mayor of a place made up of so many strong and resilient communities. Everyone has a right to feel safe in our city. Nobody should face discrimination or be verbally or physically harmed because of their race. Thank you to the organizers of this event and everyone who's supporting both physically or virtually. By working together, we can stamp out the hate and create a city that is safe for all.
How is everyone doing today? My name is Yusuf Sirajuldin. I'm an Egyptian Canadian, and I'm here as part of the Islam Unravelled anti-racism initiative. We are working together to help address the challenges of racism and discrimination faced by Canadians across British Columbia, as well as across the country. Islam Unravelled is the official faith-based community convener for the province of British Columbia. To start today, we want to acknowledge that our work and lives take place on the traditional unceded territories of First Nations people of Canada, as well as treaty territories. As this event's organizers, we acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississauga of the Credit, and is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississauga of the Credit, the Anspec, the Chippewa, and the Wendat people. We also acknowledge that Metro Vancouver, the Fraser Valley, and the Lower Mainland in general are on the unceded territories of the Tsleil-Waututh, the Squamish, Musqueam, Hildsum, Katsi, the Kwantlen, the Kiklament, the Matski, the Kayat, the Simahuth, the Swasin, and the Solo nations. To start today's event, we are going to acknowledge and offer our condolences to the First Nations people of Canada in general, and the Kamloops Indian Band in particular, on the horrific recent discovery of the bodies of 215 children buried at a residential school. We are your allies, and we stand together with you in addressing the systemic racism and discrimination you continue to face. I would like to ask everyone to observe a moment of silence and thought. I would now like to pass it on to my co-host, Ryan Chan, from the Chinese-Canadian National Council for Social Justice.
Thanks, Yusuf. My name is Ryan, and I'm the project lead on online hate and social media at the Chinese-Canadian National Council for Social Justice. CCNC-SJ educates, engages, and advocates for equity and justice for all in Canada, with a focus on issues facing the Asian Canadian community. We work with various EDI organizations across Canada, including Project 1907, who has graciously agreed to kick our event off. Representing Project 1907 is Ellen, who through events, programming, education, and resources aims to explore the nuances of intersectional experiences as entry points to building collective action and solidarity within and across communities experiencing racism. Thanks, Ellen.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everyone. Good evening. As mentioned, my name is Ellen, and I'm a community organizer with Project 1907. I'm calling in from the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As we have heard, the remains of 215 children were found at the site of a former residential school right here in British Columbia. This is the confirmation of a truth long known in Indigenous communities. Today's conversation about facing race and stopping Asian hate needs to be considered within the context of this genocide. We need to consider how we benefit from settler colonialism, how we are complicit as settlers, and what we will do to disrupt this ongoing colonization. Project 1907 is a grassroots organization. We work to elevate Asian voices that are underrepresented and undervalued in mainstream political, social, and cultural discourse. Right now, one way we are doing this is by collecting reports of anti-Asian racism nationwide. We work with the Vancouver Asian Film Festival on its Eliminate Hate campaign, and are also partnered with the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter and Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice to capture a holistic picture of the scope of anti-Asian racism in this country. I will share some updated analyses based on the data we have collected, which I hope will inform and set the stage for this evening's forthcoming conversation. So if you can just give me 1 minute. Since 2020, over 1,500 incidents of anti-Asian racism have been reported to eliminate hate and fight COVID racism. Per capita, Canada has more reported incidents than the United States. And our updated metrics as of this month show that we have more reported incidents by 100%. British Columbia continues to have the most reported incidents per capita of any North American province, state, or territory. And women continue to be disproportionately impacted by this, reporting over 60% of all incidents. The majority of folks reporting are East Asian, followed by Southeast Asian and mixed race individuals. But we also know that this is impacting our South Asian community, Indigenous communities, and all kinds of folks who identify as Asian. Verbal harassment is the most commonly reported type of discrimination, and it's included in 67% of all reports. Assault makes up 1 in 4 incidents, and that number is continuing to increase with each analysis. When adjusting for population, this is the breakdown of incidents by province. British Columbia leads, followed by Ontario, Alberta, and Quebec. And by city, we're seeing Vancouver with the highest number of reported incidents, followed by Toronto, Calgary, Montreal, and Ottawa. Incidents are taking place everywhere. Almost half are taking place in public spaces, on streets, sidewalks, in our parks. Businesses such as grocery stores and restaurants are also sites, online, private residences, and alarmingly, on public transit and in our schools. We want to encourage everyone, if they feel comfortable, to please come forward. You can report anonymously at eliminatehate.org or covidracism.ca. Every single report is feeding into a larger picture of the experiences and needs of the Asian diaspora. So I hope these updated statistics provide a bit of a backdrop for the conversation we're going to have today. Canada needs to get over its angel complex. We are no better than the US. We are no better than any other country. We need to confront the reality of what's happening in this country. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Ellen, for sharing that amazing presentation. Again, many of us are unaware of the numbers and because of the lack of data and information. So thank you for helping to work towards solving that challenge. Up next, I'd like to introduce the Honorable Harjit Sajjan, our Minister of National Defense. Minister Sajjan has made serving others a cornerstone of his life. He has served as a former detective with the Vancouver Police Department, a former Lieutenant Colonel with the British Columbia Regiment, and a longtime advocate for youth education and mentorship programs. We are honored to have you here with us today, Minister Sajjan. Please go ahead, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. And before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And as I make this acknowledgement, it makes it even more poignant and a reminder to all Canadians as with the recent discovery of the mass grave of the First Nations children, that we as a nation have a lot more work to do, and that collectively coming together as Canadians, that we can do more, and we must do more for our First Nations communities. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the organizers and partners of today's events, including the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, Islam Unravelled, the Anti-Racism Initiative, the Anti-Racism Network, and Resilience BC. And I'm also pleased that the Government of Canada is among these valued partners, as my good colleague, Minister Chagger, had just made her acknowledgement. I also like to acknowledge our parliamentarians that are also joining us here today. Now, looking across also the screen, seeing familiar faces, individuals from all walks of life, sectors, and experiences, it gives me great hope that we are occupying spaces, sharing stories, ensuring that Asian Canadians are heard, and allies can stand shoulder to shoulder to help amplify their voices. The past 15 months have tested Canadians and the world in a way unlike any other. While we have been challenged during this pandemic in different ways, isolation, worried about our loved ones and our health, the amount of Asian hate and anti-Asian hate crimes growing in our communities, especially in Vancouver, has been extremely alarming. That these incidents are not in a vacuum. They affect our friends, neighbors, colleagues, family, and much more. And I know how much it impacts all of you. As a friend, neighbor, and colleague, I want to tell you that I see you and that I also stand with you. Our government is absolutely unwavering in its commitment to diversity and inclusion, including tackling all forms of systemic racism and discrimination. And as earlier, that's why my good friend, Minister Barish Chagger, the Minister of Diversity, Inclusion, and Youth, established a new anti-racism action program, which empowers communities on the ground who have the awareness and expertise to address all forms of racism and discrimination. 85 projects worth over $15 million were selected through a call for proposal to support the anti-racism action program's objectives, which will help combat all forms of racism and discrimination, including anti-Black racism, anti-Asian racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. The local, regional, and national projects will also help to address barriers to employment, justice, and social participation among Indigenous peoples, racialized communities, and religious minorities. We know that there is always more to be done, but working collaboratively with all levels of government, local community organizations, and more, I know that the work will not stop. Regardless of where all of us live and what we are doing, we all must come together and work together. Standing up for our fellow Canadians does not stop. We must be relentless when stepping up to hatred in all forms, including anti-racism, anti-Asian hate. Microaggressions, innuendos, ignorant commentary should be called out by you and by me and by everyone across this country. The responsibility to educate and correct ignorant or racist behavior should not solely fall on the victims of these crimes. And when I first read the report of Vancouver being the Asian hate crime capital in North America, this breaks my heart. And I know that it breaks everyone's heart. I've grown up here. I've benefited from the rich, diverse, beautiful blend of cultures and communities. I like to think that we have come a long way from when my dad had to drive around with a field hockey stick in the backseat of his cars, and just in case. And it wasn't to play field hockey. It was for protection. And far too often, my sister and I had to see him use that hockey stick in the form of self-defense. And then I realized, you know what, this is not simple. If sometimes it feels like that we take 2 slow steps forward and then 1 step back. And I think of the thousands of Vancouverites mobilizing to speak up for their friends and neighbors. I look at this event and I see all of you. I see young Canadians across Canada engaging at all levels of government to discuss institutional and systemic racism. I see them sharing the untold stories of their parents, their grandparents. I see them taking a stand, loudly stating that this is not acceptable and this will no longer be tolerated. I see all of this and I feel confident that there's a willingness to end this racism, that we are relentless as a country and that we will all face this head on because we are going to all work together as communities, as Canadians. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Minister Sajan, for sharing your experiences. We're really grateful that the federal government sees and stands with community organizations like ours so that we can provide a united front to combating all forms of racism, and in particular, anti-Asian racism. So to kick us off, I'm going to introduce our first panel and our panelists. Our first panel will be online hate and how disinformation drives real-world violence. The objective of this panel is to educate the public about what is fueling online hate, particularly in regard to white supremacist ideology. What has been the experiences of the Asian community and how social media platforms are being used to connect hate groups and spreading hate. Our first panelist is Tony McAleer, a former neo-Nazi and founder of Cure for Hate, speaking about white supremacist psychology, ideology, and impact today. Our second panelist is Mohammed Hashim, who is the executive director of the Crown Corporation, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, and a founding advisor of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. He also sits on the board of trustees of the United Way of Greater Toronto. And last but not least, we have Val Spicer, sergeant at the Vancouver Police Department, who has a PhD in criminology from Simon Fraser University. She is dedicated to going beyond the call and embracing the standards of performance that include integrity, compassion, accountability, respect, and excellence. Welcome, everyone. So to kick us off, I have a question for Tony, and everyone feel free to jump in. So social media has been weaponized to promote transnational right-wing extremism, including anti-Asian racism. This has led to right-wing movements, right-wing governments coming into power all around the world, and has inspired countless white supremacist movements. Can you tell us a little bit about, what exactly is white supremacist ideology, and what is this great replacement theory? And, is there any way we can actually tackle these beliefs?
That's a great question. Thank you for having me. And I too come from the Vancouver, the Lower Mainland, and the unceded territory of Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Salish, Musqueam bands. And thank you all for coming here tonight. I think to understand where these ideologies gain their power, because they always seem to be talking about the loss of something. And I think the only way that you can understand the loss, when you understand the sense of entitlement and privilege upon which it's based. And the United States in the 2000 census, and it was similar here and similar in the United Kingdom, for the first time, they put a date by which whites would no longer be a majority in those respective countries. And white supremacist movements seized upon that census data to say, look, we are facing an existential crisis to the existence of white people. The 14 words is the most famous slogan behind white supremacy, and it's we must secure the existence of our people and a future for the white race. And if you look at things like the Great Replacement theory, and these theories go back decades, it's the perception that the other is coming to replace our position of power and privilege, the position, if it's not my position. And I think you have to understand that sense of privilege and entitlement is the fuel upon which these organizations exploit using fear. And with the internet has now made it easier for individuals to find like-minded individuals and to spread their ideologies of fear and mistrust and misinformation in the society. What makes social media so dangerous is what makes social media so great, in that it allows us to connect and build community and relationships for better or for worse. What white supremacist groups have done, particularly, if you go back looking to Anders Breivik in Norway about a decade ago, who killed 76 people. That was the first time that a manifesto had been published. And with each increasing attack, and I just want to say here, I think the comment made earlier about Canada and its angel complex, I think is absolutely right. In Canada, there are just as many hate groups per capita as the United States. While we have had attacks on gurdwaras, we've had attacks on churches, we've had attacks on synagogues, we've had attacks on mosques throughout the world in this sort of transnational wave of white supremacist terrorism. One of those attacks was here in Canada in the mosque shooting. And when we talk about white supremacy, there's different facets to it, and I want to just sort of distinguish what I'm talking about today. I'm talking about the very virulent, violent white supremacy. Other forms of white supremacy is some of it's misinformation that can be corrected with education and awareness. Some of it, people have the wrong ideas or they've learned the wrong thing. Those things can be corrected. But this violent white supremacy is something which needs to be taken much more seriously, and the response to it is not educate. Well, some of it's education, but really it's a law enforcement response. It's an intelligence response from the country's intelligence agencies. It's a legislative response, and at the same time, it's a whole of society response. I think this challenge of racism in all its different forms is a whole of society response, and I don't think we should wait for somebody else to do it. It's who are we going to be in every moment of every day? Are we going to be silent, or are we going to be heard? Are we going to intervene, or are we not going to intervene? But with each attack, going back to the transnational terrorism, they build upon each other. And each one adds a new component, and the whole purpose of these attacks and manifestos and components is to create notoriety, to create fame, to be remembered forever. And I had the luxury of spending a day in Paris at the Christchurch Call, and I got to meet Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who very wisely chose not to name the attacker of the Christchurch massacre, and denying him that prize and that reward that he sought for that attack that he did. And that Christchurch attack was, it was the first time something was live streamed. And I think even today, if you look hard enough, you can find that video. And social media companies have squashed millions and millions of versions of that video. But the challenge with the internet and these ideologies and this terrorism is it kind of lives forever. There's this electronic space that has no borders, no boundaries, where these manifestos live, the ideology lives. The people can come and go. They can, but it's the energy of it lives on forever, and it's a very difficult, complex task to try and address. I spent a decade when I was co-founded Life After Hate in working with social media companies and government trying to tackle these issues, and it's a very intricate process, but it's something that we absolutely have to address.
Thank you, Tony. Then, that segues really nicely into my next question. So, Mohammed, Tony mentioned a few things, particularly about extremists' desire for fame and to be seen and to spread, the kind of ideology, for example, like the Great Replacement theory. So, it seems that one of the issues that we need to tackle is moderating content, ensuring that this kind of thing doesn't keep getting passed along, doesn't keep getting shown. So you and your organization, the CRF, ran a poll that said the majority of Canadians support, combating online hate and doing something, having some government intervention. But discourse these days, it's just entirely dominated by concerns about content moderation. It went as far as to force the Minister of Canadian Heritage to amend his Bill C-10, which has nothing to do with content moderation, but just goes to show that people were so concerned that he had to clarify that it had nothing to do with content moderation. So do you really think Canadians are willing to support what's needed to combat online hate?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. And I'm here speaking to you from Mississauga, which is the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Ojibwe and Chippewa peoples, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I just want to acknowledge that tomorrow I believe all the flags in all federal buildings are going to be lowered to half-mast in recognition for the 215 kids that were found in the mass grave. And I think that's a good acknowledgement, but we need to do a lot more. And until we all stand, not just to express sorrow, but to seek justice for what has happened. That's where we need to be going. And this is an important moment to make sure that we recognize our collective desire to do so. So we actually asked a question, and another question in the poll where we asked, well, first of all, we asked people if online hate was a problem, and about 93% of the people said yes. We also asked a question, and I'll read it to you exactly the way it was. It was, we gave people a choice. I worry more about the impact of hate speech and racism on people it harms and the impact on society overall than on limits to people's freedom of speech or protecting privacy. So, and then the other side was basically, do you want to prioritize freedom of speech over harm reduction? And we saw that 70% of people wanted to see harm reduction be prioritized over freedom of speech. And I think that I think the reality and all the rest of the stats that we looked at were very demonstrative of the fact that the experience of hate online is so proliferated that, when you're talking to 18 to 29-year-olds, at least, and particularly women between 18 and 29-year-olds, they're experiencing online harassment, violence, sexually inappropriate advances, and just general hate and racism at higher rates than anyone else in Canada, to the point where 4 out of 5 people are experiencing that. So the problem is very real. Now, the question you asked is that are we going to go in the right direction where content moderation will be seen as acceptable when you think that the current political context of this moment is pushing us away from that? And I'm a trade unionist. I've been a union organizer for the last 15, 20 years, and I know tough fights, and this is going to be a tough fight. We knew that this is going to be a tough fight from the beginning, that the fact that right now people have an expectation around what the online experience is going to be, and people think that anything goes. And people think that they expect anything to go. So I think no matter what legislation comes, and I still believe that legislation is going to be coming. Anytime I've spoken with members of Heritage Canada or the Department of Heritage, they've always been very clear to say, and so has the minister, that there is legislation that's coming. But I also think that it's really a matter of us choosing what kind of experience we want to create online. Because the reality is that we know there is a problem. We know there's victims to this thing. It's not a victimless crime. And to be frank, when we talk about like Quebec City, I was there the day after the massacre. I had to meet the kids and wives and family members of people who were shot there the night before. I mean, I've seen bloody carpets and bullet holes. Like the impact of online hate is not something that's just there. Like, we've seen people radicalized, and we've seen the blood on those floors. This has happened here in Canada. So I'm hoping that that people are going to take it seriously, and that the fact that this person was radicalized online, and that and when we talk about radicalization online, I think we really need to think about how it happens. It doesn't happen where somebody's just going there automatically looking for something to find that's going to be turning them into a white nationalist or a terrorist of some sort. It's when you're almost at any time, you're 3 clicks away from seeing the most hateful content. You can click on a COVID conspiracy, that can click on to somebody else, that can click on something else, and then all of a sudden you're in that dark hole. It's not hard to find, it's easy to find, and it's absolutely necessary that we have a conversation about content moderation, because I think that's where, if we don't address that, we know that the tremendous power of the internet, and we know that these ideas, and we saw that on January 6th as well, that these ideas can find very violent expressions. And we just need to make sure that we get to a point where we actually come to a consensus around content moderation.
Thanks, Mohammed. So, Val, like Mohammed has mentioned that, we certainly have to have that conversation about content moderation, and, it's going to be a long and it's going to be a painful process, but what can people do in the meantime? So, you're with the Vancouver Police Department. What are you guys able to do about online hate, particularly, that which results in real world crimes? What kind of community support do you guys offer? And, other than perhaps just plain law enforcement?
Well, thank you very much for having me here tonight to speak on this very important topic. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently presenting from the city of Vancouver on the unceded traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. In my role at the Vancouver Police Department, I am the sergeant in the Diversity, Inclusion, and Indigenous Relations section. And one of the positions that I hold within that section is the hate crime investigator. So a lot of the statistics and cases that the Vancouver Police Department has been reporting on has been under my purview. Very difficult year, very difficult couple of years in the realm of hate crimes. When I first took the portfolio, it was in 2017, and we were trending at about 100 cases per year. And this year we will surpass, in my opinion, the 300 mark. We've reported widely on cases going up by almost 100%, and I'll speak in real numbers because they are small numbers. We went from 142 incidents reported in 2019 to 218 in 2020. We continue to see an increase, And same period last year, from January to April, we saw 49 incidents, and this year we're seeing 92. And what was very concerning during the pandemic was this trend towards violence. We saw an increase in assaults. We had 27 assaults in 2019, and that went up to 74 in 2020. We also saw what we widely reported on, a significant increase on anti-East Asian incidents that went from 12 in 2019 to 98 in 2020. So these numbers are concerning. They're a reflection in small numbers of what many people in community are experiencing. And we took a position as a police department to be broadcasting this information and to encourage people to report. And we also took a broader definition of what hate crimes are to include those more smaller incidents that could actually lead to much more serious offenses. We know from other significant global events at mosques, synagogues, or other places of importance to cultural communities that there are sometimes smaller incidents, perhaps a suspicious person or mischief or other incidents of concern that could trigger the police to sort of look into the matter and hopefully prevent. We also know that hate crimes in general are very underreported crime. We don't have a lot of statistics here in Canada, but the 2014 General Social Survey conducted by Statistics Canada does give us a good indication. In that year, that report did ask, how many people had experienced a hate crime. This was a victimization survey. We don't do it yearly on hate crime, so we don't have that data, but we do have it from 2014. And at that time, the report was 330,000 hate crimes reported through victimization survey. That same year, it was under 1,400 cases that were reported to the police across Canada. So we can infer from that study alone that it is an underreported crime. So we, as a police department, brought in significant mechanisms to encourage reporting, and that started all the way from the 911 call takers taking the cases and putting them up onto dispatch, and our officers actually investigating and documenting all of them. So I just want to bring this to the table because we know that they're underreported. So if we create mechanisms to increase reporting, we will see the increases that we have seen. That also is a reflection of what's going on in society. And the trends can actually change very quickly depending on local, national, and international events. And so as a police department, we need to track these things very, very carefully. Now, the intersection with social media and the internet and the radicalization on the internet should be of great concern. Some people refer to that as hyperspace, where the social media space connects with the physical space into very serious incidents. And the mechanisms that we have in law are extremely limited. Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Code used to be able to be used, and in fact was used in past on social media type platforms. But that particular section of the Canadian Human Rights Code was repealed in 2014 because of Section 2B of the Charter of Rights. And that Section 2B is the one that bounds our freedom of expression. And that is also the section that is impactful on some of the hate crimes that we investigate. However, I do see a lot of hope in human rights codes, specifically BC human rights codes and Canadian human rights codes, because I feel that racism, hatred, bias, and prejudice are very well dealt with within that realm. And anything that we can work together in expanding the role of human rights in these kinds of domains so that people feel safe in society is of extreme importance, because the criminal code has such boundaries in what we can actually proceed, and we're often faced by that barrier. I also want to sort of kind of mention the idea of social media as being a global phenomenon. So we'll see cases reported to us that's happening on social media, but the person who's actually broadcasting may be in a different country, impacting someone locally. So from an investigative perspective, those are very complex cases to investigate, because they cross national and transnational boundaries. So I hope that kind of provides some context, and I certainly can take some questions. I do want to mention that recently, I would say in the past 6 months, we have seen a significant increase in the cases that are reported to us that are happening on social media. And we do encourage people to send those to us, because we work closely with other sections in the police department, our criminal investigation unit, and also the BC hate crime team on these cases. And so we do follow up on every incident that's reported to us.
Thank you so much, Val, and thank you for some of those statistics. You know, it's shocking that it's so underreported, and that you could have as many as 330,000 incidents. So you touched on Section 13 of the Human Rights Code, and I understand that that was repealed. And a lot of the discourse at the time was regarding fear of infringements on free speech. You know, and like you said, the criminal code just doesn't cut it. So, you know, we are running a little bit low on time. So if you know, the panelists would like to take like 2 or 3 minutes each to perhaps discuss this issue of, you know, free speech. You know, Mohammed mentioned a little bit about it, but, you know, what can we do to change the public's attitudes towards it? You know, what's the starting point? How do we get people to stop being so afraid of like a little bit of regulation, you know, and thinking that, you know, the free speech police are going to come breaking down our doors? You know, like what can we do to change public attitudes towards that?
I can jump in a little bit. So, I mean, I think the first thing we got to do is we have to build confidence in what the set of values and rules of what content moderation is going to look like. Because like right now, I think nobody knows who's going to get blocked, who's going to get accelerated, who's going to get decelerated in terms of spread for online speech. But because there's no real sense of transparency to say, this is what social media companies are doing, because social media companies are just doing what they want to do, and nobody really knows what they're doing. They say they're moderating content already, but nobody knows exactly how they're doing it, what algorithms they're using, what algorithms they're not using. There's no level of transparency. It just happens. So I think that the most important thing for us to be able to build is for the government to be able to say, okay, here are the set of values, that here are the laws around hate speech. Here is how we're going to implement our current set of legal parameters around hate, and then how we're going to, this is how we're going to ensure it, and do it in the most transparent and honest way possible. Because if we don't do it, we'll never gain the confidence of people to be able to say, well, like this is like what my opinion is. If it's right, it should be online. And people need to feel that to be the case 100% of the time in order for them to buy into the idea that content moderation is a good thing.
I just want to add to that. Having spent time down at Facebook and working with them with Life After Hate, we had when people were posting offensive, really extremist content, we did a redirect method where they were sort of referred the opportunity to click to Life After Hate to connect, to get resources to off-ramp them. But you know, when you start looking at keywords, there's all kinds of unintended consequences, and you think, well, you know, we'll put Adolf Hitler in, right? And that's an easy one to get rid of. But then it blocks content elsewhere that is part of legitimate historical discourse. So I watched them struggle with you know, it's easy to say something is hateful, but the how else could it be interpreted in the context, which makes which makes it confusing. I had the dubious distinction of being prosecuted under Section 13 of the Canadian Human Rights Act in the early 1990s, so I'm very familiar with that. I think what needs to be done to get Canadians on side is it needs to be really well defined, and being really clear on what is hateful versus say what is offensive, because offensive can be very subjective. And I think Canadians' concerns are sort of mission creep. Okay, we're not going to allow people to say this, and then it's sort of inches further. I think if you clearly define it and put guardrails around that and explain it to people, I think that helps, because I think there's a lot of talk about eliminating and getting rid of everything and content moderation of online hate, but in my opinion, it's light on rigorous definitions that could make Canadians feel at ease with some sort of regulation.
Val, do you have
Yeah, I think this is the very, very tricky part about freedom of expression in Canada. And Section 2B, which is enshrined in our charter, and the charter, 1982, it's been that document since then. It is what constantly changing our laws. And, that charter section does impact human rights as well. So however, which way we craft ways to curb expression, it always becomes very complex within the legal domain. It might be that the Canadian public wants some bounding of expression, but as long as that section is there, the judiciary will have an obligation to consider every case in relation to previous cases that have been repealed, or actually legislation that's been repealed because of Section 2B, and all of those court cases apply moving forward. So it's one of the most complex aspects of this problem, and specifically with Section 319, willful promotion of hatred. That section actually has statutory defenses embedded with that section, which makes it even more complex because you have to consider those statutory defenses. Now, Section 319, because of those statutory defenses, might not be, you can't pursue them in a criminal case, but certainly could probably pursue them under BC human rights codes. And we've seen examples of that.
The one thing I just wanted to add there is that, I 100% agree with both Val and Tony that we need to make sure that the guardrails are really well understood. But on top of that, we need to make sure that there's a recourse, that Canadians know that they can challenge whatever, like if something has been taken down, to be put down, to be put back up. So that at least through the process of taking things down, putting things back up, taking them down, putting the things back up, we'll learn the systems will learn better slowly by slowly, and we'll be able to tweak new levels of ensuring that the environment is getting better and better through time.
Well, thank you. I think that's a good positive note to end that off. I appreciate everyone's input. I think the guardrails and having this recourse is definitely something that we should definitely consider and should be implementing in legislation. So thank you so much. That was Mohammed Hashim, Tony McAleer, and Val Spicer. Next, we have a quick interlude from a message from Dr. Santa Ono, President of the University of British Columbia. Dr. Ono is a biomedical researcher and entrepreneur, university executive, and member of both corporate and nonprofit boards. He is a frequent keynote, motivational, or graduation speaker on innovation, social science, mental health, and education. He is also an advisor to educational institutions, corporations, and governments. Welcome, Dr. Ono.
Thank you very much, Ryan, and it's really wonderful to be with everyone this evening. I'm speaking to you from the ancestral unceded territory of the Musqueam people and in the Okanagan from the Silks Okanagan Nation. I also want to say, before I make my remarks, that this conversation, this panel is very germane to what happens at universities, not so much with regard to online hate that occurs as well, involving members of our community, but also with respect to invited speakers that come onto our campuses. So this challenge is something that's very familiar to me at the university level, and it is certainly something that needs to be discussed and resolved moving forward. So I applaud everyone on the panel for thinking that through. I'd like to thank the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice, the official faith-based community convener for the province of British Columbia, and the Islam Unravelled Anti-Racism Initiative for organizing this really important event today and for inviting me to participate with the other speakers as we work together to stop Asian hate. Today's event is taking place, as we've discussed, against an alarming backdrop of anti-Asian racism and the continued tragedy of the COVID-19 pandemic, including a devastating humanitarian crisis in India. And yet, even in the face of such daunting realities, we see communities coming together, raising their voices and offering support to one another within and across borders. And that's the, I guess, the silver lining to this difficult situation. As we've discussed, Canada is not immune to anti-Asian racism. Yes, we do have to get over this angel complex. Systemic exclusions of Chinese immigrants began over 150 years ago and continued through the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War. The more recent wave of anti-Asian rhetoric and violence was amplified by COVID-19 in this latest chapter of a long and tortured history here in Canada of anti-Asian racism. In these different moments of our history, we also know that Asian women have and continue to be disproportionately victims of anti-Asian racism and violence, as you saw in the data that was just revealed just moments ago. To my fellow Asian community members, I wanted to say that I stand with you. I share in your grief and have experienced anti-Asian racism as recently as just 10 days ago, personally. And I want you to know that I see you and share in your pain and want to do something about it. To the many organizations and people that already work to challenge ongoing forms of anti-Asian racism and discrimination, here, online today, at UBC, in Vancouver, in BC, across Canada, around the world, I thank you for all the work that you have been doing for a very long time. Together, we all have a part to play in undoing these pernicious forms of racial violence and injustice. The faculty, students, and staff at UBC are going to play a part. There are many scholars who work tirelessly at our institution to combat forms of anti-Asian discrimination daily through their research and also their activism. Staff across our institution engage in anti-racism work as they deliver resources and services in support of UBC's commitments. And most importantly, students in and out of our classroom lead and advocate for social change that inspires hope, that motivates people like me. So hats off to the younger generation. Together, we all have a part to play, as I said. And I want to tell you about something that UBC is doing, and I hope you all will attend this event. On June 10th and 11th, UBC will host a two-day national forum on anti-Asian racism in Canada. And many government officials from both the provincial and federal government will be there. Community organizers, scholars, public intellectuals, as I said, key figures in government, healthcare, media, journalism, the corporate world, and the not-for-profit sector will converge to have frank discussions about the root causes of anti-Asian racism in our country. We'll be releasing 3 new opinion polls that we've commissioned from the Angus Reid Institute. And we'll have frank discussions about anti-Asian racism in Canada and around the world, with the aim of articulating how we can work together, unified, on bold and concrete recommendations for action. we need you to be there with us. There'll be sessions focusing on issues impacting Asian Canadians, coalition building across Asian Canadian communities, and other racialized communities, and effective access and advocacy for systemic change. While it's focused on anti-Asian racism, this national forum will also examine other forms of racism, in particular anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism, and fortify our relationships in advocacy. Anti-Asian racism will not be eradicated because of this two-day forum, but I believe the forum will help spur a much-needed national conversation, and that's why media will be there. And I invite you to join us. You can find more details online at ubc.ca/anti-Asian racism. In closing, thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to speak to you. Thanks everyone for being here today. We look forward to working with you the rest of tonight, but also at the forum and in the many months and years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your voice with us today, Dr. Ono. And again, we encourage everyone to go to events@ubc.ca to learn more about the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism, as well as other amazing events that the University of British Columbia hosts. Our next panel will look at real-world racism and the role NGOs play in both confronting systemic racism as well as in supporting communities. We plan for this panel to inform and educate on how rising hate crimes, incidents, biases have impacted racial and religious people, with a particular focus on our Asian communities. To provide context, the death of George Floyd and the ensuing wave of global protests has prompted many Canadians to take a deeper look at systemic racism and discrimination. For instance, LGBTQ plus Canadians continue to face hate and discrimination decades after being specifically protected by the Bill of Rights. In 2018, Black Canadians were more likely than any other racial group in Canada to be the victims of a hate crime. This year, nearly a dozen visible Muslim women have been attacked on the streets of Edmonton and Calgary. Muslim elders have been slain by white supremacists at their mosques in Toronto. And just this week, the horrific discovery of 215 children buried at the residential school in Kamloops has shown that generational lived trauma and racism faced by the First Nations people continues to exist. Today, it is Asian Canadians who are most likely to be the victims of a racist attack. 2020 and 2021 saw a dramatic increase in anti-Asian hate and assaults against Asian women, men, children, and elders. In Vancouver, as Mayor Kennedy said in his opening video, 717% increase in hate crimes against Asian community members. Across the border in the United States, attacks against Asians, including the horrific Atlanta City shootings on March 16th, saw 6 Asian women killed by a white gunman and was the culmination of years of rising anti-Asian and racist rhetoric, discriminatory practices, stereotypes, and dehumanization, particularly being spread online, and especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. So this has been part of the real impact on people's lives and what systemic individual racism looks like, the microaggressions, the verbal and physical assaults leading up to even murder. However, part of what we want to do here is not to just talk about the problems that exist, but also the solutions. Specifically, the role that NGOs play in addressing this. We want to highlight the services and resources they offer to support communities' mental health, counseling, language, and other resources. So with that note, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Amy Chang is the Director of the Strategic Initiatives and Integration at Success. Success is an international intercultural multi-service agency that assists people in all their stages of their Canadian journey. Amy provides leadership in the areas of strategic initiatives and integration, and she's responsible for leading the process to secure program funding, conduct research and data analysis, tracking, as well as analyzing their policies and implementing the performance of quality programming. Today, there was an amazing event that Success had that I took part in, which was active witnessing and how to become an active anti-racist and how to support people who experience trauma. It was a fantastic experience for myself, and I learned a lot. Our second panelist is Alicia Yao, and she has been the executive director of the Chinese Community Policing Center for the past 5 years. The CCPC is a nonprofit organization providing language-specific victim services and outreach programs to promote personal and public safety in local Chinese communities. She's passionate about equipping people and transforming organizations to reach their full potentials and bringing lasting impacts to our communities. And lastly, we have MP Randeep Sarai. He is the MP for Surrey Centre, a member of the Standing Committee on Justice and Human Rights. He is also the founder and has served as director of Visra, which is an organization supporting youth and strengthening families as well as society. And he also helped to start the South Asian Community Coalition Against Youth Violence. So thank you all for joining and participating in today's panel. I'm going to start our first question directed towards Amy. So Amy, basically, the increase in hate crimes and racism targeting the Asian community has resulted in not only physical, but also social and mental trauma. This has been compounded for many of our youth and elders because of the isolation of the pandemic. And an important aspect of the work you and Success do is in supporting new immigrants to Canada, many of whom are Asian. How has the increased anti-Asian racism during the pandemic practically impacted the lives of the families your organization supports?
I want to start by thanking you for inviting Success to be part of the conversation today. I would also like to acknowledge that I am joining from the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Solo, Chunamis, Tsawwassen, and Musqueam First Nations. I want to express gratitude and honor the Indigenous peoples who are the keepers of these lands that have existed since time immemorial. I think it's important to start by recognizing that anti-Asian racism, it's not something that's new, that just sort of started during the COVID-19 pandemic. There's been a long history of racism against Asian communities across Canada. For example, the Chinese head tax, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the internment of Japanese people. These are just some of, a few examples. I think many of us might not be very familiar with, this long history of racism in Canada, including myself, right? So I would encourage everyone to take some time to continue, this learning, right? To learn about this history. So even pre-COVID, we regularly heard stories about how people in the community were experiencing hate and discrimination. So this was before, January 2020, this was happening already. What's happening now is sort of a continuation of this. An Insights West survey from last month, so April, I found that 77% of Asian British Columbians have experienced racist comments, discrimination at work or school, physical assault, or property damage since living in BC. 77%, like that's an astonishing and shocking number, but also at the same time, not really a surprise for the people who live this experience every day, right? Like we know this is true. And we know that the actual number is probably much higher because a lot of people, probably underreport. A lot of the hate that's been directed at Asian communities, it's also rooted in the intersections of like racism, xenophobia, classism, and misogyny. At Success, we've heard numerous stories of people in the community who feel unwelcome and just unsafe. They're apprehensive about leaving their homes, and they're exhausted of having to be sort of on alert all the time and be prepared for something that could happen, even if that means you're just walking down a couple of blocks to go grocery shopping, or you're taking transit to work because you're an essential worker, right? And it's not just fear for themselves, it's having this fear for what might happen to their elders, their kids, other family members, their friends, their neighbors. Another thing that we've heard is that a lot of people are not just fearful of being like on the receiving end of an attack, but also, the thing that probably is even more sort of alarming is that they're scared that no one's going to help them if something happens, right? That other people will just stay silent, that they're going to ignore the situation or pretend they didn't see it. Or that if they go through the process of trying to report it, that no one will believe them, or that it'll be downplayed because there wasn't a witness, or there wasn't somebody with an iPhone capturing the incident that occurred. And for many newcomers that we work with who might have lower levels of English proficiency, many also fear that they're going to be taken less seriously because they're not able to articulate in English what happened, right? So they're afraid that, oh, nobody's going to take me seriously. So, what's the point of reporting, right? And like, if you think about this, all this adds up, and it's a lot of ongoing anxiety. It's a lot of stress, trauma, and grief. And there's been a lot of impacts on people's mental health and well-being due to these constant feelings of like fear, exclusion, and isolation. People are traumatized by, both the pandemic and all these hate incidents that we hear about and experience, whether you're a receiver or a witness. At Success, we've seen a marked increase in people who've been reaching out to us for help, particularly our helpline services and our counseling services this past year. But at the same time, we know that there are a lot of people, especially newcomers, who are not reaching out for support because there's still a lot of stigma around, reaching out for mental health and wellness type supports as well. So with the COVID-19 pandemic, we all know that we can try to protect ourselves from the virus by things like physical distancing, wearing a mask, staying local, getting vaccinated. But how do we protect ourselves against racism and hate, right? So we really need to build that, community of support and advocate and support each other and build solidarity networks because a lot of this needs to happen at the local community level. That's where we help each other out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. What you said was very interesting and meaningful. Actually, when my father immigrated to Canada from Egypt, he didn't have those support systems in place to help him with that transition. So what has Success done really to help not only immigrants, but also the Chinese victims of racism, Asian victims of racism, especially in this during the pandemic year? What are the programs and services that you found were in demand and need and that you provided?
So at Success, we're kind of doing work on sort of two levels, right? So we're doing our best to support the community through our direct programs and services, as well as through our advocacy work. So we're really proud to convene the Resilience BC Anti-Racism Network in the Spoke community of Tri-Cities. So that's, for them, people who might not be familiar, that's Coquitlam, Port Coquitlam, and Port Moody. And the team there has been working with local partners to develop, community response protocols and support networks to people who are experiencing, racism and hate incidents. At the program level, we're also trying to scale up a lot of our key areas of work that support the mental wellness of people, right? So that, like I mentioned, our helpline services and our counseling services. We're also right now in the process of planning some community events and webinars around mental wellness and self-care, as well as sessions to support immigrant families. And our goal is to be able to offer these in different languages in order to meet, to be more accessible to different communities. As you mentioned a little earlier, we've been doing a lot of bystander trainings for the community for free, so that people can learn the tools to be active bystanders and intervene when they witness incidents in the community. So whether it's just like in your neighborhood, in a store, at a restaurant, at school, or at work. So late last year, sort of into earlier this year, we were able to do 4 of those sessions. This month, we've done 2 sessions already, one just this morning, and we have more planned. Our next one is going to be on June 23rd. And then after that, we're going to continue to roll these out in the community as well. Right now, they're all online, but we'll see, depending on the COVID situation, if we're able to, do in other formats as well. We're also working to offer a series specifically for frontline social service workers so that they can learn how to incorporate some of these tools and information into as part of their client service delivery as well. So that's something we're working on. And then at the advocacy level, Success would continue to advocate for change at the systems level. So everything from, the ethical collection and use of race-based data, more sustainable and long-term funding on anti-racism initiatives, because we know that, we're not going to solve this in a 1-year short-term contract kind of project. Greater education, and awareness around historical and contemporary racism and the different forms that it takes, as well as policy changes to eliminate inequities, right? From the treatment of migrant workers to our foreign credential recognition system, to a better access to safe and affordable housing, and so much more. So at Success, we're going to continue to share with those who are in positions of power and influence what we're seeing and hearing from the community, and to push for those positive changes that are needed in all sectors. And one thing I do want to add, is that, you know, I hope that this conversation and the work around anti-racism, it's ongoing, right? That, you know, there isn't just this attention and awareness on it because, you know, there's some new statistics that came out, or there was a major incident that was reported in the news for a few days, right? But that we care about this all the time, and that we have a long-term commitment to this work to create the changes, because we know that long-term work is what is going to be required. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. And actually, that's a perfect segue into a question for our next speaker, Alicia Yao from the Chinese Community Policing Center, because they are in it day in and day out on the ground, also providing support and working with the community. So Alicia, my question is that when people hear Community Policing Center, they might have an image in their head of a law enforcement organization. However, we know that that's not the case. Can you maybe tell us a bit more about the CCPC, what it does and its role in the Chinese community?
Thank you for having me. At CCPC, we run 3 levels of programs based on geographic boundaries. First, locally, we have a citizen patrol program, community cleanup programs, covering all the way from Science World to Gastown and anywhere in between. Our volunteers are the backbones of the programs. And if people experience long-standing safety-related issues, we connect them with our neighborhood police officer to find a solution. Second, in the City of Vancouver's jurisdiction, we provide free translation interpretation services for criminal matters and culture language-specific victim services to Chinese victims of crime. Our victim services follows a holistic, trauma-informed approach and provides support throughout the entire process, from their experience crimes to even years after the sentencing. Regardless of whether the victims decide to file a police report or not, they can access our services and gain emotional support as well as practical support. Third, we run safety workshops, events, and other initiatives throughout the entire Greater Vancouver area. Because people are highly mobile in Greater Vancouver area, it's very common for someone to live in Surrey, work in Vancouver, and have dinner enrichment with friends and family. That's why we go all the way to where they are to equip them with the knowledge and tools to protect themselves and their loved ones.
That's wonderful. I think many people need to understand the real services and value that is brought by such organizations as the Chinese Community Policing Center. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the 2 kind of pandemics that were being faced by people in the Asian community were the COVID pandemic and the racism pandemic. What have you seen due to on-the-ground work that you're doing within the community? What has been the experience of Asian and Chinese senior citizens and women in particular?
I definitely echo what Amy mentioned. Racism against Chinese has always been there, and we see it everywhere. When the pandemic started, the first hit was taken by our clients who were victims of domestic violence. From the start, the social and economic pressure and isolation at home increased the number and severity of domestic violence. The victims could not talk to their support workers and access the same level of support as freely as before, because the abuser might be in the same space. The court process had already been super long, and the availability of shelters for Chinese victims have already been extremely low before the pandemic. It was worse when the pandemic happened. Unfortunately, the only thing we could do for them was to increase our emphasis on emotional support and work harder to find resources to meet their practical needs. As time went by, very soon, We witnessed the racism comments blaming Chinese people for the pandemic quickly escalated to anti-Asian hate crime. What was disheartening was that some Chinese people from other regions posts on social media blamed people from mainland China for the anti-Asian hate crime. Last year, in response to the pandemic, we first offered to interpret over three-way phone calls to make it easier for Chinese people to file a police report in non-emergency situations. We have engaged with 600 local businesses for safety check-ins and over 3,000 participants from safety workshops, webinars, and events. When everything turned virtual, seniors were more isolated than ever before. We worked closely with senior homes and other service providers. We had an emotional support hotline for seniors during the lockdown period and turned our safety webinars to call-in conferences to allow seniors participate. We also launched racial harmony webinars for the Chinese community to tactfully respond to racism and anti-Asian hate crimes. In addition, we have given out around 2,400 personal safety alarms to seniors, female employees of local businesses, and other vulnerable populations. Hopefully, the loud sound would scare the perpetrators away and draw others' attention to come and help. Despite all the challenges, I would like to share a successful story with you. It has been years that we saw on the news that Chinese seniors and other residents in downtown Eastside were competing for resources. And we helped many innocent Chinese seniors who were attacked because of this perception. We also heard seniors telling us they would like to help homeless people, but they don't speak English, cannot even communicate with them. In 2019, one of our volunteers had the idea to organize seniors to knit hats and scarves for homeless people to foster a positive relationship and show care. It was a great success. When people received the package, it definitely melted my heart that they put them on right away and asked us, do I look good? And left with a smile. Last year, despite the pandemic, we worked with our community partners and mobilized over 100 seniors to knit over 200 sets of scarves and hats. We plan to continue this project as it really showcases community members come together and help each other.
Shishi, Alicia, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate you highlighting the role that the Chinese Community Policing Center does for people on the ground to really improve their lives, whether it was the translation services or law enforcement liaising or the street patrols, to help our seniors, because they are our seniors, to traverse the kind of difficulties of being an immigrant, being a racialized minority, and being a victim of isolation during the pandemic, as well as being targeted. So this example that we heard from Success, as well as the Chinese Community Policing Center, really shows the importance of NGOs and the work they're doing to support really vibrant and beneficial communities. The other arm of this is the support of government and the role that our elected officials are doing to help with creating cohesive and beautiful communities. So I'd like to now introduce MP Randeep Sarai from the federal government. They've worked to address real-world hate, including increasing anti-racism funding for NGOs and community organizations, as well as developing anti-racism awareness campaigns. I'd like to ask you, MP Sarai, in your role on the Standing Committee for Justice and Human Rights, what have you seen to be successful and what work still needs to be done?
Thank you, Yusuf, and thank you to all the panelists and especially the organizers of this event. It's an amazing job that you've done to put together such a great panel and discuss this. And I hope this work bears great fruit as anticipated. So I can say on the Justice Committee, my role is recent. I've just got on, and there hasn't been, I would say, something as recent because 2019, the election happened, and literally a few months later, COVID-19 happened, and a lot of the focuses has been in regards to COVID-19. But I can tell you a lot of the other initiatives that the government has done that has targeted this, and I'll say right from the beginning was to get a fair representation in Parliament and in Cabinet of faces of Canada. So if we have reflection of at our Cabinet table, in our Parliament itself, that brings people to the table where these things, as Minister Sajjan has discussed, or and my colleague MP Jenny Kwan will speak afterwards, to see people from all different ethnicities, LGBTQ backgrounds, age groups, it helps. It makes a huge difference. What I will say, from October 2018 to March 2019, the government under the Minister of Heritage did an engagement process. They engaged in over 22 in-person forums. They welcomed approximately 600 people and 443 organizations to find out how to develop Canada's anti-racism strategy. And that was formed in 2019, and it's a 3-year process. It was given $45 million in investment to combat racism and discrimination based on what we've heard from the engagement process, and supported by research of the likes of universities. So this strategy will help complement the existing government efforts aimed at eliminating inequities by focusing on kind of 3 guiding principles: demonstrating federal leadership, as I mentioned earlier, empowering communities, and then building awareness and changing attitudes. One of the first initiatives from that was the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat. So there's an actual secretariat now created to look at this and to do that analysis on a whole of government approach. So everything from our funding to our every single piece of legislation to every single program. How do we do an analysis to ensure that there is protection of minorities, an analysis of whether any policy, any hiring, etc., how can it help fight anti-racism? How can it prevent racism? And this was given even more funding in this fall economic statement. So Minister Freeland in the fall of 2020 gave another $50 million for this. In this current budget, another $11 million was given to Canada's Race Relations Foundation. So to get more data, as we're hearing from many of the organizations here, this is a way we are able to tackle the problems when we have that data. Another initiative that we did that is more bricks and mortars was the initiative that it's an existing policy but was opened up to more. It's the security infrastructure program that was already there for places of worship, community centers, particularly for those like Asian communities, Islamic communities, Jewish communities, anyone that can have been targets of it, where the government will match up to $100,000 to make them safer for women, make them safer for the elderly, make them safer for those that are visibly targeted, and these are for non-for-profit places, places of worship, community centers. On top of that, I think another very powerful challenge that was given was the 50-30 challenge, which is for governments and the private sector and anyone who engages with the federal government to have 50% of your boards to be gender balanced, so to have both genders on the board, and 30% to be represented from underrepresented communities, to get more visible minorities, to get more underrepresented communities, LGBTQ, Indigenous, etc., on those civil and private sector boards. This will help combat not only racism in the government sector that might potentially or systemically be there, but also in the private sector to enable to tackle those initiatives. So these are very important. And I think there's another kind of elephant in the room that that I feel had a big factor. We all are kind of seeing that as that has been our neighbor to the south, the leadership there prior, Donald Trump. The words that were, we used to have a history, if you look at it, of naming tornadoes and hurricanes after female names, and people came to, why are always hurricanes named after women? And scientists and those that analyzed those started finally changing that attitude. But scientists were great at viruses. They didn't name a virus after a particular place or an ethnic group, etc. However, President Trump did, and I think that caused a lot of overt racism, things that otherwise would not be expressed. I think that overtness of it spilled over, and unfortunately, we still have more Canadians watch American media than we watch our own media. So that spillover effect has increased, and thus this anti-Asian influx of crime. So we need to work on that. We need to really combat that. I think the fact that we do this analysis and we have a secretariat, that all legislations, including the ones on online hate that Mr. Guilbeault is looking at, and how we formulate that, how do we balance and protect freedom of speech while at the same time being responsible in our communications. So I again want to thank you for putting this forum together and for highlighting and discussing this, because this is the ongoing process. I never forget my professor at UBC, who's a guest professor, said, he was from Vienna. I said, Canada's all watching this multiculturalism experiment Canada is doing, and they're all expecting it to fail. But I don't want it to fail. But I will tell you, you always have to be constantly vigilant to always tweak it, always perfect it, because we're no angels. We all have to always look at it very carefully. And I think that's exactly what you guys are doing and what others are doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Randeep. I really appreciate your words. I was actually wondering how long it would take before someone brought up Mr. Trump on an anti-racism call, and it's an hour, 27 minutes. So I think that was pretty good for us. Again, I'd like to thank all our panelists on the second panel for their voices and sharing their words and their thoughts. I'd like to now move on and transition to the third panel. And to do so, I'd like to introduce the moderator for that. My dear friend and colleague, Tarek Tayyab, is one of the co-founders of Islam Unravelled. He's the vice president of the BC Muslim Association, the largest Muslim association in the province, representing almost 100,000 Sunni Muslims. He's also a co-founder of the Muslim Food Bank and Community Services that just celebrated its 12th anniversary. Tarek, please.
Thank you, Yusuf. Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank everybody for joining. I am presenting from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish, and want to honor our brothers and sisters from our First Nations hosts. So I have the honor of presenting this panel, which we're celebrating historic and contemporary achievements of Asian Canadians. So this is near and dear to my heart. My grandfather and my father lived in Hong Kong, our family, before they came to Canada. And so my father speaks Cantonese better than he speaks our native tongue of Urdu and Punjabi, so lehoma, and really appreciate being here. And so I grew up with the knowledge of Confucius and his teachings, his analects, and Lao Tzu, the Art of War, Lao Tzu and Lao Tzu, the Art of War, and the Tao Te King, and all the Eastern philosophies and martial arts. My personal hero is Bruce Lee. And so all of these things have shaped my personal life's journey is Asian culture, which I believe is mainstream culture, because Asian culture with meditation, yoga, Qigong, martial arts is all mainstream now. So that being said, I'd like to introduce our panelists. First off, we have the honor of having Barbara Lee, the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, one of the founders, and one of the founders of Eliminate Hate. Barbara has spent over 25 years as a community advocate for increased representation of Asian Canadians and people of Asian descent in front and behind the camera. She has extensive experience organizing grassroots events to increase the profile and opportunities for Asian artists in mainstream music, film, and media. She is the founder of the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, the oldest Asian film festival in Canada, the co-founder of the Mighty Asian Movie Making Marathon in its 16th year, and founder and producer of Asians in Movies, Music, and Media Summit. And on top of that, Social Justice, a founder of Eliminate Hate, provides an anonymous and safe reporting environment for Canadians of Asian ancestry experience anti-Asian attacks to consolidate public resources in an accessible format to victims to utilize report data for actionable change. And my other panelists, we have Jasper Sloan Yip, who's the coordinator for the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society. The Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society is a registered secular nonprofit organization with year-round programming in the arts and culture scene. Their mission is to foster and promote and celebrate the arts and cultural diversity that Asian Canadian communities bring to Canadian society. And then finally, we have New Westminster City Councillor Nadine Nakagawa. Nadine is a community organizer and local activist and city councillor for New Westminster. She has worked on social issues related to housing, public spaces, reconciliation, public engagement, and childcare, and is the chair of the Reconciliation, Social Inclusion, and Engagement Task Force and chair of the Environment and Climate Advisory Committee. For her work in the community, Nadine was named the 2017 Citizen of the Year at the Chamber of Commerce Platinum Award. So I want to thank our panelists, and our objective with our panel is to highlight and share the cultural accomplishments impact of Asian Canadians, as well as the influence of Asian leaders, culture, and philosophy on Canadian society. Again, I mentioned the philosophies like Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism, Shintoism, etc., and the impact of Asian Canadians on literature, on politics, on business, on the environment, social justice, sport, fashion, and all these other sectors that Asian Canadians play key roles in. So thank you, everybody. So first off, the first question is for Jasper Sloan Yip from the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month. So please share the history and impact of the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society and explore Asian initiatives. What are the events and annual programs you host and the vision behind them?
Thanks a lot, Tarek. Hi, everyone. My name is Jasper. I'm here with VAMS. So the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society was formed in 1996. We are a nonprofit, and our mission, as you said, Tarek, is to promote and celebrate the artistic and cultural contributions that Asian Canadians have made and continue to make to Canadian society. We run programs all year round, but our signature program is Exploration Festival, which is on right now. It is a Metro Vancouver festival that showcases Canadian arts and culture during Asian Heritage Month. But like I said, we do work with our community partners and to produce and promote events all year round. But I suppose to answer your question more generally, I think of the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society as a platform. It's a platform for Asian Canadian artists and educators and organizations to showcase their work. It facilitates culture exchange between all communities, between Asian communities and between non-Asian communities, and it's a bridge. So, you know, year round we produce, like outside of the festival, a lot of our initiatives are sort of webinar based, or I mean, lately they've been webinar based, but sort of discussion based explorations of histories and cultures. And during the festival, what we do is we try to get all of the Asian Heritage Month celebrations and initiatives and educational events that are happening in the Metro Vancouver area and put them all in one place. And promote everybody and promote everyone that's celebrating their culture for Asian Heritage Month, and make it easier for not only for like Asian communities to connect, but make it easier for non-Asian communities to engage with all of these amazing events and cultures that are happening during Asian Heritage Month and learn more about them.
Thank you, Jasper. And my next question is for Barbara Lee. And Barbara, please talk about the origin, vision, and impact of the Vancouver Asian Film Festival. And please share examples of how storytelling can break down community silos and stereotypes. Barbara, you may be on mute.
Typical. Okay, thank you, Tarek and Yusuf. And I'd like to first start by acknowledging that we at VAF are grateful to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We hope that wherever you are situated, that you also will take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous communities that have taken care of Turtle Island since time immemorial. So to get to your question, the Vancouver Asian Film Festival, like Asian Heritage Month, is celebrating 25 years. 25 years ago, when I started the festival, I really didn't know what I was doing. I just knew that I didn't see anybody like myself anywhere in media, on film, on television. And when I did, I always tell this story. When I was younger, on my family's little black and white television, I actually thought Elvis and Cher was Asian, or else they looked more like me than anybody else that was on television. And that is sort of telling of the time that we grew up. And so when I went, a friend of mine took me to the Seattle International Asian American Film Festival, and I saw Sandra Oh open her film there with Runaway. And that was the first time I saw in a theater somebody who looked like me up on screen, and everybody was cheering afterwards. And I thought, there's got to be something like this in Vancouver. So I came back, I had a short film, and there wasn't anything. And I thought, okay, let's do this. How hard could it be? But as Jasper knows, organizing grassroots events is very time consuming. But there's a passion and there's a group, and we really, over the years, we built a community of filmmakers and storytellers. And we really wanted to give a platform and a venue for people of Asian heritage, Asian Canadians, to tell their stories authentically and to tell them from their perspective with their voice, not through a filter, not through gatekeepers. And so when we talk about storytelling, VAF, one of our core beliefs is that storytelling is one of the most effective tools to combat racism. Storytelling and film and television and media have the power to change people's minds and attitudes and perspectives. And through sharing our stories and sharing our lived experiences, we can help people understand where we come from, and we can understand where others come from. And I think that is a very important piece of it. So I wanted to just go through some of the studies of why representation and storytelling is so important in film, television, and media. Because popular media can have negative impact on what the white community's perceptions of people of color are. A lack of contact between racial groups can lead to greater reliance on media stereotypes when formulating ideas about people outside one's race. So there are communities of people who have no contact. So all they see is what's on television on their screens and what they consume. So it's really important that our stories are there, that we're crowdsourcing our stories and putting it out there. And right now we are running a project called Reclaim Your Name. And it's really about people from the Asian community who had to feel like they had to adopt a westernized names to fit in. And we're asking them to tell us their story. And if they didn't take on a westernized name, did people mispronounce it? Did you always feel this uncomfortableness of telling people your name? So we really think that that's a great place to start, because how easy is it because whenever we meet somebody, we start with introducing our names and unpacking what all that means. So I've reached out to many people in the Asian community, and they always say to me, well, I don't think my story's that interesting. I don't think my name's that. And as I talk to them, their stories are so interesting, and there's so much depth and richness to it, and believing that our stories matter. That's part of what VAF does, and that's part of what Eliminate Hate wants to do, is to start these conversations, very baby steps. We're having this giant conversation about how to approach racism, but I think we all just need to start talking to each other and start finding commonalities and finding where we can exchange our stories. So that's one of the things that VAF does. Another point is that when we do see BIPOC images, it's often negative portrayals, which can adversely affect how people of color see themselves. There's studies that shown prolonged television exposure predicts a decrease in self-esteem for all boys and girls of color, and an increase in self-esteem for white boys. These differences correlate with the racial and gender biases in Hollywood, which casts only white men as heroes while erasing or subordinating other groups as villains, sidekicks, and sexual objects. So a lot of these stereotypes and the way we're presented gets put into our own minds, and into other people who have never really experienced or exchanged, had interactions with communities of color. So it's really important what we see in here. Another one is that the erasure of people of color in media communicates to the BIPOC that they don't matter, that they are not valued, and they don't exist in society. So part of what we need to tell and talk about, especially to government officials, people who are funding productions and the screen industries, our stories need to be funded. Our stories need to be told. We need to break down that barrier of language and that white colonial view of what is art and what is valued. So that's something else that can be done. And there is, so I'll cut it short, but there's so many racist images that have a cumulative effect on society. And we can't dismiss the media's differential portrayals of racial groups as mere entertainment. We need to seriously look at their impact on our youth and also the greater society, because storytelling media now has become, as we talked about in the first panel, what we're hearing and seeing on online is affecting all of us, and we need to take it back. And how we take it back is to get our stories out there, is to tell our stories, get out there, be on social media, like things, go to Asian Heritage Month, see the artists, support them, get our voices, because as a community, we have not developed that muscle memory of speaking up and speaking out. What VAF wants to do is build and give opportunities and create pathways and ways to uplift each other, so that when somebody speaks out, you don't have one voice, you have many voices supporting and amplifying and repeating, because only then we can crowd out the other hate with uplifting stories from our own community.
Thank you, Barbara. And I want to appreciate Reclaim Your Name, my name, Tarek, in school, and Jenny Kwan, our final speaker, grew up in that neighborhood. And I remember the teachers, when they'd come to my name, they wouldn't be able to pronounce it, or they'd butcher it terribly. And then they would say, "Can I call you Tom or Rick?" And I was like, "No, I don't think so." So Reclaim Your Name, thank you. I really appreciate that. And that is a very great initiative. And I will be sending a video on that for you. My next, our next panelist, and the question we have for her, Nadine Nakagawa, City Councillor for New Westminster. Please talk about your experience as an Asian Canadian elected official and your advice for other Asian Canadians interested in public service. And Nadine, what has the role of Asian Canadians, particularly Asian women, been in leading social movements, for instance, social justice, human rights, and environmental conversation? Nadine, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. And I'm on the unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking people. New West, the royal city, has a deep colonial past, and we have a lot of work to do to uncover whose histories of this land that we're actually on. I also appreciate the Reclaim Your Name. It wasn't until I was elected that people seemed to manage to get my last name right. It always seemed to be okay to make fun of it or to mispronounce it. And then all of a sudden I'm elected and people seem to manage to get it right. So people can pronounce your name if they feel that it's, if they feel that it's in their interest to do so. I'm in my first term as a city councillor, and while there has been a lot of amazing elected representatives to look up to. I mean, Jenny Kwan's on the call tonight. We have Olivia Chow out in Toronto, and now some younger women as well, like Katrina Chen and Bowen Ma at the provincial level. It's at the local level where we see the worst representation, that we see the least amount of women, we see the least amount of cultural and racial diversity. And so along with my colleague Chinu Das, I'm one of the first two people of color ever elected to city council in New West. And in running for office, there's all sorts of things that you have to consider when you're a racialized person. Just even thinking, if people saw my name on a ballot or on a sign, would they vote for me? It's something, even though New West is a very, very diverse community, these are things that people who come from, who are white, don't have to think about. I'll say in general, New West is a very progressive city. We have great representatives in the mayor's seat at MLA and MP. So the experience has been very, very positive. But certainly when I walk into rooms, well, I don't walk into any rooms nowadays, none of us do, but back when we used to meet in person, I'd walk into a room, Union of BC Municipalities, for example, which is all the city councillors from throughout BC. And I stuck out like a sore thumb. I think people were like, how did this like young woman of color get in here? Because there was basically nobody else in that room who looked like me. There's very, very few other folks. And I will, comment as well that very few Black elected representatives, very, very few Indigenous representatives in that room as well. So there's lots of work to be done there. So say, overall the experience has been very, very positive. But something that, a lot of Asian women face is perceptions of who we are. And I get a lot of people, I think, thinking that I'm very angry. I get the angry woman trope. Especially when I speak up about racism, is that people, I get told a lot by people that nobody likes you. And I don't think that any of my colleagues, especially my white colleagues, especially my colleagues who are men on council, have comments made about their likability, their personal likability. And that's something that we have to face. I strive to be actively anti-racist. I strive to be in solidarity with Black and Indigenous communities. I talk a lot about race at council. I talk about gender. I talk about disability. I talk about issues in a way that I don't think we've heard in those council chambers before. And it does make me unlikable. There is absolutely no doubt that if a colleague who is white says something that's anti-racist, it's applause all around. If I say something about racism, people say, why do you make everything about race? Why are you so angry and unlikable? So there's all those things to contend with in reality. And there is absolutely no doubt that it is very, very challenging when you bring all of your identities to a place that is not used to seeing people like you. There's no doubt that it is challenging. I do run a program along with my colleague Trudy Goals called Feminist Campaign School, which is trying to get more people who are underrepresented in all the ways, whether that's people who are low income or renters, because they're also underrepresented on councils, people of color, women in lots of communities, gender minorities. To run for office and also to run campaigns. And we talk a lot about leading with your values, because for me, representation is not enough. There's, a saying that I've heard from Dr. Cornell West or Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, it's not about more Black faces in high places. And I say that about, Asian communities as well, that it's really about getting elected to interrogate those high places, to interrogate those systems of power that lead to the impression of all of us, truly. So the Feminist Campaign School is a lot about that. So the value is always that, you need to be actively working on anti-oppression. You need to be in allyship, embedded in community, to be working to uplift those issues. It's not about you sitting at the table. It's not about me sitting at the table. It's about the work that we go there to do that. When you're folks like us, it takes more bravery, more courage, and more allies and more community to keep us on track. So really just encouraging folks to make sure that they're solid in their values and they know why they're doing it. Again, just representation is not enough if you're upholding those systems that are going to hurt members of your community. So being sure that you know what you want to do once you're there.
Thank you, Nadine, and very, very, very important message and perspective that to share with our viewers. Now, one topic, because all of us here are passionate about social justice and our community from every color and background. Let's talk about influences from the Asian community that have influenced you to your work today. So I'll start with Jasper, and then Barbara, and then Nadine, just how you got to where you are today and some of those influences that you're standing on the shoulders of giants. Please, Jasper, you go ahead, and then we'll go to Barbara.
Great, thanks, Tar. Well, the first person for me that comes to mind is my dad. I'm a mixed race person. My dad is Chinese, and my dad taught me how, he very passively taught me showed me how I wanted to be from a very young age. He's not a person who talks a lot, but he's a person who does a lot. And he taught me, he showed me that I can do a lot. I can listen. He taught me how to listen, how to be humble. He taught me how to take care of other people. he taught me, he infused a lot of values of kindness and service into me, just through acts of kindness and service. And it took me a long time to really understand that, and get to a place where I can start to articulate what it is about my father that is so ingrained in me. But anytime I'm asked about a role model or someone that I look up to, he's the first person I think of. So that's my answer. My dad.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Jasper. I have the similar sentiment for my dad, and I'll go to you, Barbara. Barbara, please, your influences and role models.
Okay, so I just wanted to say I always go to my parents. As immigrants, watching them is always very inspiring and disheartening at the same time. There are things that, as immigrants, and from the old school, that I don't agree with, but things that they did to survive that I really uphold and want to emulate. So, but for people that on screen, that's something that VAF does, is that we didn't have role models. We didn't see ourselves put up there. And I'm doing this documentary that's been taking me 8 years, but a lot of people in a lot of generations still say Bruce Lee, and even you said it, because there hasn't really been anybody there to be there. And I interviewed somebody and he said, it wasn't until Bruce Lee that Asian men could be strong and sexy and, forceful. And who has come? Jackie Chan, yes, and other people, Jet Li, but there really hasn't been somebody North American here that we could aspire to as a community. Sandra Oh is amazing. That's somebody else I would say. She's really led the way. We talk about, and in this, in these last few years, the Asian community has come out to speak up. Daniel Day Kim, Tamlin Tamita has been an amazing friend to VAF. She inspires me, and she was one of the first young Asian women I saw on screen that, that I could say we're being represented. But I think we need to do more. I think there's much more that needs to be done in terms of role models. I think there's a lot we as a community we keep our head down. We don't want to be, seen. We don't, because people who make waves get there, get stomped on. So that's part of the community, something that we have to get over. We need to celebrate. We don't just to be critical. I was on on CBC, they were talking about the Kung Fu cast, and there was certain criticism that they didn't represent everybody. Well, they don't have to, just because we have that one Asian character or one Asian cast, they don't have to represent all of us. Just the fact that we're seen as human with different and not all the same. We're not monoliths, so that these stories about us should not be just, represent all of us, and we have to have all these different personalities. I think starting with the one and adding to it, Crazy Rich Asians is not a lot of Asian communities' reality, but being seen, Farewell, that's another one. And having Chloe Zhao talking about, just doing work. So we just need these people to do and be accepted for who they are and what story they want to tell, not be ghettoized with their storytelling, but also when they do want to tell a story about the community and bring somebody who looks like them up on the screen to give them that opportunity. So I say that there's a lot of people doing a lot of good work. I think we all need to help them and support them. And then there'll be a lot more role models for our generation and our kids to come up and to say, look, I can do that too. Look at so-and-so doing what they're doing. Sandra Oh being a lead in a series, amazing. It took how many years? Because I started the film festival 25 years ago. She was on the screen for her first runaway, and only a few years ago did she get her own lead. So think about how long that took. These are the kind of things that we need to push forward, and I can't say that anymore and emphasize it anymore. We all have to be putting our eyeballs on them. Putting our consumer dollars against them, advocating. We all have a responsibility.
Absolutely. Thank you, Barbara. Well said. And Nadine, Please, your influences, role models. Thank you. Please.
You know, I mean, my grandma is quite a delight. You know, she just turned 98 this year. But I also want to uplift some of the younger activists that I see out there as well. There are some amazing young people who are absolutely going to surpass all of us in the work that we're doing and make the world a better place, like Tessica Trong, who is a co-founder of City Hive, a youth engagement organization and climate justice organizer. The people at Hua Foundation, like Kimberly Wong, Elaine Su, they're amazing folks who are doing just great work doing, you know, work talking to their communities, for example, about like anti-Black racism within the Chinese community. Amazing work, hard work. Yarrow Intergenerational Society, also doing work to support elders with youth. There's just some great people out there, and they're very, very exciting. And they give me so much hope about the way that the world is going. So just so much thanks to everybody who is really stepping up. And I think bringing such a intersectional a lens to the work and bringing such an interconnected lens, like really looping a bunch of issues together. So yeah, very exciting folks out there.
Thank you, Nadine, and well said. The leaders of tomorrow are role models, and they are amazing, as you mentioned a few of the names. And now, thank you to all the panelists, really, really insightful, and I'm sure we could keep talking for hours about many aspects of Asian culture and contributions. But now another superhero, MP Jenny Kwan, who's been tirelessly for many, many years, working hard for her community, working hard for social justice. So MP Jenny Kwan is a member of Parliament for Vancouver East, my old neighborhood. And for over 28 years, Jenny Kwan has worked for the people of East Vancouver in 2015, and she was elected as the Member of Parliament for the community. She currently serves as the NDP's critic for immigration, refugees, citizenship, housing, as well as deputy critic for health. I'll turn it over for our closing comments. Thank you, MP Jenny Kwan. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And as I was listening to the panelists, I really resonated with many of the points. And Robert, just to your point about reclaiming your name, boy, that brings up lots of memory and history and stories. And Nadine, to the notion where people say, when you raise these issues that matter so much to your personhood and to your identity, you know, I get accused of being uncompromising. I'm emotional, you know, and almost irradical, right? And so, you know, and that is the stereotype that goes on. So before I make further comments, let me just say that I'm zooming in from the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples unceded Coast Salish territories. And in doing the land acknowledgement, it is essential that we take to heart the words of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report, which stated, and I quote, "Reconciliation is not an Aboriginal problem. It is a Canadian one. Virtually all aspects of Canadian society may need to be reconsidered." And these words, I think, are particularly salient in the face of the horrific findings of the remains of the 215 Indigenous children at the Kamloops Residential School. And in this process, I would also like to acknowledge and recognize the triggering and re-traumatizing of Canada's genocide against generations of Indigenous peoples and the urgent work that needs to be done by all levels of government and every Canadian moving forward. I'd like to take a moment and to say thank you to all the organizers for bringing us together today to discuss stopping Asian hate, Asians and Allies United, and to all the speakers for sharing your knowledge, your expertise, your passion with us today. And indeed, May is Asian Heritage Month. We have, I think, just a couple of days left in May. And this is the second Asian Heritage Month to take place amid the COVID-19 pandemic and rising Asian hate. And to the Asian community, let this be the month to strengthen our connection to our heritage, to our history, community, and to find the strength, the resilience, and love that we need to fight against racism and hate. And let us hold each other in solidarity and care as our communities grieve the ongoing pandemic tragedies, especially our South Asian community with the devastating crisis in India right now. Inclusion and justice means that all entities required for dignified living, such as income, healthcare, and housing, are accessible, and that essential workers on the front lines, including migrant workers, are recognized and protected. And make no mistake, hate and discrimination is rooted, in my view, in a class structure. The goal of systemic racism is aimed at keeping people down. What is the purpose of laws that says you cannot enter into various professions, that says you cannot own property? Slavery, it is about denigrating the person, stopping them from rising up. And since the beginning of the pandemic, and there has been public actions and calls against anti-Asian violence and racism, mass public protest movements against police violence, and to say that Black Lives Matter, rallies to call for justice for migrant workers, and for people gathering in the streets to protect resource extraction and development taking place on unceded Indigenous land without free, prior, informed consent, and calling for a true reconciliation that dismantles colonial institutions and laws. Transformative changes are needed in our laws, government and institutions to reconcile and to make reparation for Canada's colonial history, to root out systemic discrimination, and that includes the need to eliminate the root causes of poverty and inequality. Equality of rights is supposed to be at the core of Canadian law, as enshrined in our charter, and yet this is not the reality, and for far too many people. People do not have equal access to housing. There is no national rights-based approach to housing, and there is no national urban Indigenous housing plan that is by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. Law enforcement disproportionately affect Black and Indigenous peoples. People living with addictions cannot access the healthcare that they need, and instead are often criminalized. People do not enjoy equitable access to prevention, mental health, and addiction supports. And the chronic underfunding and defunding of these services is a sample of systemic racism that exists within government. Canada must take bold action to tackle systemic racism and recognize that racial disparities in education and learning, employment, food and water security, health and child welfare, housing and homelessness, income and social assistance, immigration and newcomer settlement, justice and policing, and poverty are persistent and real. To improve safety for members of our community, we must invest in people. And Canada can afford to have a guaranteed livable income so that everyone has access to income and food security, safe housing, and safe transportation. The Atlanta incident is a reminder of the intersections and the deadly effects of not only racism, but also misogyny. We must also address policy issues that increase people's vulnerability to violence, including decriminalizing sex work and fighting against stigma against sex workers. While we're often tempted to think that racism is a problem confined in the United States, and yes, Trump was a problem, make no mistake about that, and he elevated that. But the truth is, racist verbal and physical attacks for Asian Canadians are on a sharp rise. And according to Bloomberg, Vancouver is the Asian hate capital of North America. In Vancouver, as has been mentioned, anti-Asian hate crimes went up 717%. And every attack is aimed at stripping us of our sense of safety and dignity. And it is a clear message to say that we are not wanted and that we do not belong. Now, I'm glad that we are making some effort in addressing these issues, and that in the House of Commons, I was able to get a unanimous motion adopted that called on the government to include anti-Asian racism in Canada's anti-racism strategy and all anti-racism policies and programs. What we do need, as has been mentioned by the NGOs, and I'm so grateful for the work that they do, we need to ensure NGOs are provided the resources that they need to fight against Asian hate, and to provide support to victims. They have the trust and relationships with the people on the ground, and they can break down cultural and language barriers. But they can't be doing this work off the side of their desks. Dedicated, stable, predictable core funding, and not just program funding, is needed to tackle this essential work. And not just at this moment in time, but all the time. Alongside the work of NGOs, we also need to ensure culturally and linguistically appropriate mental health services are accessible, available, and affordable. With the rise in Asian hate, we cannot underestimate the impact and trauma this insidious behavior can inflict. The federal government has spent and continues to spend nearly $10 million a day on the RCMP. That's more in a day than the Liberal government has spent in an entire year on mental health services and funding to fight against Asian hate. The government can fix this massive imbalance and start backing up the symbolic gestures with real concrete action. So together, today, as we talk about this, as we join together in a call for action, as we share our experiences, our knowledge, our expertise, and as we're so aware of what is going on out there for not just this moment in time, but for so long it is part of Canada's discriminatory history, shameful history. Let us bring all of our voices together, Asians and non-Asians alike, speaking with one heart, one mind, one voice. So let us stop white supremacy. Let us stop Asian hate, and let us demand better, because better is possible and must be the path forward.
Agreed. And thank you very much for those comments and your great work. And we support you, and we're working with you in every which way that we can. Now, thank you very much to MP Jenny Kwan and our panel, just our organizers, just one last word from Ryan Chan and Yusuf Siraj, and then we can end our program. Thank you. Yusuf, Ryan.
Thank you so much, Tariq, and thank you for sharing your voice with us today, MP Kwan. We really appreciate it. We're now at the end of our event. I'm going to start by thanking and appreciating all our speakers today for giving their time and their voice to help stop Asian hate and unite Asians and allies in that endeavor. Thank you, Ellen from Project 1907, the Honorable Harjit Sajjan, Minister of National Defense, Tony McAleer, founder of the Cure for Hate, Mohammed Hashim, Executive Director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, Sergeant Val Spicer, Vancouver Police Department, Dr. Santa Ono, President of the University of British Columbia, Amy Chang from the Director of Strategic Initiatives and Integration at Success, Alicia Yao, Executive Director of the Chinese Community Policing Center, MP Randeep Sarai, Jasper Sloan Yip from the Vancouver Asian Heritage Month Society and Explore Asian, newest Minister City Councillor Nadine Nakagawa, Barbara Lee, Vancouver Asian Film Festival, and Eliminate Hate. And again, thank you, Ms. Kwan. And I'd also like to thank my co-hosts, Tariq Tayyab from Islam Unravelled and Ryan Chan from the Chinese Canadian National Council for Social Justice for helping to organize and volunteer their time today for this event. This program will be rebroadcast on YouTube and Facebook and across our social media platforms. We'll be sharing a follow-up email to all our registered guests, which will include the social media links as well as anti-racist information and feedback surveys to get your thoughts on the program as well as what you would like to see in future programming. I'm now going to pass it off to Ryan to close the event.
Thanks, Yusuf. So, huge thank you to all our amazing speakers who've brought so many interesting and diverse perspectives to our discussion today. And thank you to everyone for listening in. I'd love to summarize in like a single sentence what we've talked about today, but really what it tells us is that racism is a complicated and shared struggle that requires a shared solution. We need to continue helping each other and standing united against all forms of discrimination and be committed to tearing down structures of white supremacy. As Yusuf noted, you can find more information about our speakers and their organizations, as well as our own organizations, on CCNC-SJ and Islam Unravelled's websites at ccnc-sj.ca and islamunraveled.ca. Follow us on social media at CCNC-SJ and at Islam_Unravelled, where we can